And while inflation continues to remain high in our country, a new report has found that consumer spending across industries like retail and travel and entertainment has increased this year as Canada emerges from the pandemic. For more on the spending trends in Canada and in Toronto, we're joined live by David Litwin, Senior Specialist of External Communications at Moneris. David, good to have you on this morning. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So first off, before we dive into the details of these findings, were you surprised to see that despite these challenging times, people are still spending more in some areas than they were before?
It is a really interesting finding, and to get the bigger picture of how spend trends have been evolving over time, what we did is we took a look at spend in 5 of Canada's major cities, including Toronto, and did a year-over-year comparison of volumes by month to see how these things were tracking by different industries. So when we take a look at retail, services, travel and entertainment, the beginning of the year, we see some pretty significant boosts, but that's because we're comparing against the time that was heavily impacted by COVID restrictions. But as we move through the summer, we see some of those trends decrease as we get more of that apples to apples comparison. And then by the end of our report in August, we see some of those numbers pick up, for example, at retail. But that sluggish start to the summer and throughout the spring mean that the holidays, I think, for retail is going to be an extremely important time of year for many businesses.
Okay, so does this mean then that it's really just the pandemic that slowed things down and people aren't actually spending more? They just are compared to the days when we weren't really allowed outside? Is that really what these numbers are showing?
That's correct. When we take a look at some of those external factors, we really get to see different economic trends emerging as key influencers. So at the start of the year, it was definitely the pandemic and restrictions influencing some of those larger spend numbers. But as we move throughout the year and restrictions had dropped, we see other things come into play. For example, return to office mandates may have increased spend at service stations, which in Toronto was up about 30% as people wanted to either get back and enjoy some of those experiences they didn't have, like traveling more, or return to office mandates, meaning more commuting. And as a result, spend for gas stations had increased as well. At the same time, too, there are other economic factors. For example, people are being more conscious of their spending with a higher cost of living and being more discerning with that discretionary spending.
You mentioned that, these numbers and the trends you're seeing could kind of forecast for some troubling times for businesses when it comes to spending over the holidays. So with, the holiday season somehow surprisingly approaching, what are you expecting to see? Can you go into more specifics?
Absolutely. It's a really crucial time for a lot of consumers. It's a time of year when a lot of sales happen, and they're going to be studying those sales very, very closely. And at the same time, it's an opportunity for businesses to perhaps make up for a slower summer that they experienced this year. So it's trends like that we're going to be monitoring very closely from Moneris' point of view, and we look forward to reporting on throughout the year. But needless to say, for retail especially, the holidays are going to be a particularly important time of year this year.
And just lastly, before I let you go, David, we talked about some of the industries where spending was up in some parts of the year when we're talking about retail,
Absolutely.
Travel, entertainment. Were there any industries where you noticed a particular downtrend in terms of how much people were spending?
This is a really interesting finding as well. Like when we take a look at travel and entertainment industry in Toronto, we generally see some pretty good numbers. Throughout the year at the start, there were some significant double-digit boosts, and almost throughout the entire year, you had that persistent double-digit growth. One exception to that, though, is the restaurant industry within the travel and entertainment sector. And there were some slight decreases there as well, perhaps as consumers are becoming more cost conscious. But based on the spend behavior we're seeing, it's Canadians don't want to cut these activities out entirely. They're just modifying how they're doing them. So instead of changing the number of outings to restaurants, they just might be ordering the entree instead of the appetizer and the entree. An interesting finding specifically, restaurant spend in August was down about 7%, but fast food spend was up about 3%. And that may have to do with people returning to office, trying to grab that quick bite to eat, or it might have to do with increased tourist volumes and more tourists just getting a quick bite on the go.
Some very interesting findings there. David, I appreciate you taking the time to join us this morning. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
That is David Litwin with Moneris.